tonight's event, we're teaming up with our friends at Dog Section Press again. We're very excited to be discussing Post-Internet Far Right by Sam Moore and Alex Roberts. Post-Internet Far Right was actually one of our best-selling books last year, and we're really thrilled that the authors have joined us for this evening. Sam and Alex are also the hosts of 12 Rules for What, which is a podcast and writing project about the far right, and they're going to tell us about the book and be in conversation for a while. We're also open up to questions tonight. There's a Q&A box to post your questions and a chat as well if you want to have a kind of bit more of a running commentary with the other attendees. If you want to tweet about the event, we are at Houseman's Books, and I'll be posting links to things like how you can order Post-Internet Far Right in the chat as well. With that, I'm going to hand over to our speakers and disappear.
Thanks a lot. Hello, my name is Sam. I am one half of 12 Rules for What. The other half is here.
In the guise of a book. Yes.
In the guise of a book, yes. Yeah. In the guise of this book, which I will hold up, but of course you can see it there the whole time. That's the book we're talking about today, Post-Internet Far Right. We launched the book late last year, maybe in kind of August or thereabouts. And ever since then, we've kind of been thinking about how these things have been shifting, how the things we talk about in the book have been changing. We've also got another book out, The Rise of Ecofascism, which you can see just behind me here on the shelf, which we're not going to be talking about today, although we do have another event coming up with Houseman's on April the 20th, I believe. So if you want to hear us talk about that book, which has just come out from Polity, you can get it now, then we'll do it then. So tonight what we're going to do is we're going to give a kind of a kind of guided tour through parts of the book. Lots of people have messaged us at various points after reading the book to say that they found the book clear, helpful, and so on in orienting towards the far right. And that is the intention of the book. It's supposed to be a book that is a contribution to a movement that is in progress. It's not a kind of a dry academic text that sits kind of aloof from politics and surveys the whole of the far right, or that offers distinctions that have no practical purpose and have no practical kind of use. It is supposed to be a book in conversation with an ongoing international anti-fascist movement. That is the intention, and of course we are anti-fascists ourselves. So I think what we'll begin by talking about is like how the book came to be and how perhaps it relates to the other thing that Alice mentioned, which is that we are hosts of a podcast called 12 Rules for What, which I imagine you must know if you're here. If you don't know that, that's fine. But have a listen to that. We just had a series on our new book come out, 3 episodes about the rise of ecofascism. So Alex, maybe you could kind of give us a description, like how did the work in the podcast that we did turn into particularly this book? Like how do the two parts of the project, do you think, relate to each other?
Well, I think the podcast was an interesting project. We both, I don't think, really properly done a big one, like a long-running series podcast. And there's certain things you can do really well in a podcast. You can explore one topic quite in depth in an hour, or you can run through some very basic introductions and concepts and interviews with people. But there's really, with a book, it's much more difficult to get a lot of information and have that reference all the information reference each other in one kind of item. Do you know what I mean? Like to get the full content of the book, I would say you'd have to listen to how many episodes of the podcast over how many long time, and we probably wouldn't have caught up to it quite yet. And that's just the nature of books. Is like the value of books is an objective communication and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's really the process of producing it as well. Producing a book is very different to producing a podcast, because in a podcast it's like one thing then the next thing, and you do a little bit of reading for each interview. And I don't know, you might read the person's book who you're interviewing or whatever, but you don't unlike with a book where it's like how many hours of reading do we put into the research and trawling through like internet forums and like reading, like looking at very offensive memes and all that kind of stuff. Is there's a kind of more considered process there, which I think is ultimately very useful.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot more information in the book than there will be in the podcasts. But also, I think there's a kind of, as you're saying, like the possibility of linking different parts of the far right together. and it has a kind of there's an ability to kind of give a kind of a whole account of the whole thing all at once, a kind of a theoretical clarity that can emerge from writing about something, which of course brings us
kind of like there's a kind of like cachet to having a book. You know what I mean? Like
we don't talk about that. So yeah, there's a kind of clarity that can be achieved through writing a book, and that allows us to kind of give, in some ways, like a coherent theory, a coherent idea of what the post-internet far right is as a whole, which is the object that this book, of course, addresses. And in some ways, the point of the title, there are several interlocking kind of intentions of the title, but one of the main points of the title is to make people ask the question, what is the post-internet? And to sense like be kind of stuck in that moment where you consider, well, are we in the post-internet? Have we entered that condition of being in the post-internet? And what might that mean? I think you have a really good answer for like what the post-internet is. So do you want to tell us like what does post-internet mean in this title?
I mean, it's our answer. Come on, it's our answer. But when we say post-internet, we obviously don't mean that we are as a society or us as individuals like past or over the internet. We're not post the internet in any sense that where what we mean by this is that the internet has become a technology and a communication form that like is completely enmeshed in everyday life to the point where it's completely unremarkable. And so like if I always say when I was growing up, it would be quite a thrill to get on the dial-up internet and log on to MSN Messenger. It was like a very novel,
glory days, very
novel technology. And despite the internet being around for a long time at that point, whenever I was growing up, it was still like a novel thing. People, it wasn't like, didn't see like mass adoption. Now, it's unremarkable. Like we said, you wouldn't like give your friend directly necessarily anymore. You'd like kind of put a pin on Google Maps and send it to them, or go live on your location on Facebook, whatever it is. And that's just normal. And so we wanted to think about how the far right and how politics in general has developed in that condition. And the idea is not to kind of exceptionalize the internet as a technology that's like, like completely transformative, because obviously there's a lot of things that are going on into the contemporary moment, but also to acknowledge how it is affecting change as well.
Yeah. So we give a kind of a story about like how the internet has like a kind of arisen, really. Like how does the internet transform the rest of social life? So it's not that social life kind of continued and then it kind of blended with the internet, and then social life was like it was before the internet, but the two are kind of intermingled and transformed to the extent that it's not possible to kind of distill the two apart. And this is important for thinking about politics, because it allows us to give quite a long range history of the way in which politics has been done, really, over the last, like, let's say, 200 years, which is like really quite kind of a big expanse, right? There's a sense in which mass politics, like properly mass politics with kind of big crowds of people acting in concert and so on, and political parties that have mass participation and so on, are inventions of history. It didn't exist, in the year 1000 and so on, right? These are fairly recent inventions in the kind of the grand sweep of history. But then in the immediate post-war period, there's a sense that, as in after the Second World War, there's a sense that particularly the far right, because of the atrocities of Nazism, have in some ways like disqualified themselves from participation in mass politics at exactly the moment when it's becoming most prominent. And so even though we do get mass participatory movements, of course, totalitarianism is a kind of mass participatory movement in Nazi Germany and in Italy, and in the places occupied by those countries as well, there is a kind of sense in which at its absolute zenith in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the far right is actually quite a marginal part of mass politics. So there are important and very dangerous far right movements in Italy, France, and the UK, in particular, the National Front, and so on. What happens though in the kind of the neoliberal revolution? People kind of throw this around all the time, but like I mean it quite a civic way. In the neoliberal revolution, there is a sense in which the bonds that have constructed society have been broken down. People are being kind of atomized, dissolved, and so on. And what that means for politics is that people participate essentially as consumers of politics as a kind of entertainment or a kind of content in the very contemporary parlance, right? Like it's a kind of a thing in which you are the audience for, but not a participant in. And what the internet does as a particular kind of communicative technology is in some ways reverse that change. So people get regrouped together in all kinds of new ways, but not ways that are deep and complex and in some ways kind of well balanced, like mass participatory politics was in the immediate post-war period, but in ways that are much more fragmentary, spontaneous, complicated, and fast-moving. And therefore, they kind of fracture easily. They accumulate together very quickly. Groups, come into being and then pass out of being, kind of, with extraordinary kind of tempo and extraordinary kind of rapidity. And contemporary, unlike most political theory, is just not very good at grasping those kinds of movements. It's not very good at understanding what it is that is coming into being and what it is that is dissolving. And so the post-internet far right, sorry, just a second, post-internet far right has like these movements, like for example, the alt-right and so on, which have exactly the structure. They kind of suddenly come into being, they suddenly dissolve. And that's what's kind of important about the contemporary far right.
Yeah, I just wanted to add the caveat that, of course, that doesn't mean that there are not like mass politics happening in other parts of the world outside of the West. And it's really important to emphasize this kind of stuff. But at the same time, we can see how the internet is playing a role in, like, I suppose it's playing a role in making politics much more chaotic in places. For example, in Brazil, with the kind of conspiracy theories that kind of circulated on WhatsApp, and the kind of mass uptick of like these passing around of these little false bits of fake news and conspiracy really contributed to the rise of Bolsonaro, for example. And so you can see these kind of things happening quite a lot in all over the world.
Yeah, and the ability to manipulate the internet has been quite a major part of the BJP's activism. The BJP being the ruling party in India, and in collaboration with the RSS, which is a kind of a militant far-right movement in India, they've been able to propagate their talking points, their kinds of conspiracy theories, mostly Islamophobic conspiracy theories, be able to propagate those with extraordinary speed and with essentially no kind of accountability, no ability to kind of trace the pattern of forwarded WhatsApp messages back to its source. And this has led to really extreme forms of violence. So there was a kind of, in some ways, like an interconnectedness to the bits of the far right that the internet allows. Right? I don't know about this, but I don't think that the average participant in the far right in America would have known, for example, who Modi was if Modi had been the prime minister of India in 1970. Right? There's a kind of internationalism that the internet also affords, which, although you're absolutely right, there are massive discrepancies in between the ways in which political participation works in the global south and the global north, in Europe, in America, and so on. Massive differences between all these parts. There are nevertheless, the internet is a kind of a thing that stitches all these diverse parts together. And actually, on the scale of the whole global far right, makes them quite significantly stronger, more capable of acting in concert, and so on. Although, and maybe there's this is something about what's different between when we wrote the book, which was like late 2019 to mid 2020. Was that the period when we wrote the book, roughly? Yeah. So in that period, we've still got Trump in the White House. There is a sense in which, because there is such a kind of dense interconnectedness, a circulation of kind of memes and ideas and organizational forms and feeling, which we'll get into in a bit, between the different parts of the far right on a global scale, when the absolute kind of central figure of this, which is the Trump administration in America, when that disappears, lots of the energy in this kind of becomes much more chaotic. You get the kind of the rise of QAnon as a kind of autonomous movement and so on. But also there's a sense in which like the whole historical epoch is just like changed quite dramatically by the removal of Trump from the White House. And so although it's a very active and extremely powerful kind of organizational form, being online, it's also a kind of fragile form that is subject to rapid deceleration, rapid disintegration of networks when the kind of the power of the movement that it has to exert itself into public discourse dissipates. So I think let's talk about how we wrote the book. Where did we, because I just mentioned we started in late 2019 and finished in mid 2020. So like, how did the book change over time? Like, what are we trying to do you think, when we first sat down to write this book, and what have we ended up with? And how different are those two things?
I can't actually remember, so maybe you could enlighten me.
Yeah, so I think what happened is that in late 2019, we started with 6 chapters, right? We had like 6 very clear
really?
things.
Oh my God.
So yes, and now how many chapters are there? 9, 10, 11? some sort of absurd number of chapters. But we'll talk about why those chapters are in there in a second. There are 11 chapters. Too many chapters, if you ask me, but they're all necessary, I'm sure. So we started with 6 chapters. We wanted to write about 6 distinct parts of the far right. We wanted to write about neo-reactionaries. We wanted to write about the alt-right. We wanted to write about, I can't remember exactly what the terms were. The EDL and the DFLA and different parts of the far right. But that ultimately became kind of untenable. Like, it didn't seem to make any sense to put these kind of things in silos, to treat them as separate. And like, what we got out instead is essentially one big, long thought in 11 chapters. So we started with a kind of introduction to what happens in the far right. And then from then, the next chapter is feelings, right? It's about the emotions of the far right. And we'll talk about this in much more depth in just a second. And the rest of the book in some ways concerns the process of elaborating, of building on, of organizing, of pruning and filtering all those multifaceted kinds of feelings that young men in particular, and the subject of the book is mostly young men, that's mostly who is on the far right, how their feelings are manipulated, given form, given shape in politics over the next kind of 9 chapters is really what the subject of the book is about. So having said that, do you want to talk about feelings? Tell us about why we talk about feelings and like what we do with that idea at the beginning of the book.
Yeah, so we're starting with feelings coming out of this idea of atomization and feelings of alienation in the contemporary moment. And the way that capitalism is kind of set up today is that there are people who succeed and they make lots of money, or they have very nice lives, or they have a particular social status. And these are largely, kind of unproductive jobs in many ways. And there are failures. And, to say someone is a kind of failure under capitalism is not a moral judgment at all. It's built into the system. And I'm a failure under capitalism, and so is Sam. And so are many people listening. But we still love you, of course. The point of this is the reaction people have to that failure is quite complex. Most times people, kind of wallow in their failureism and feel very alienated. And sometimes people turn to radical politics, and sometimes that's radical leftist politics, and sometimes it's fascism. And how that happens is part of what we explore in the book, and how do kind of alienated young men, young women to a lesser extent, become fascists is the rest of the book. It's without these feelings of failure, of resentment, that kind of fascism doesn't really have any ground to grow on. Without those feelings, there is no fascism. But without the means to like articulate those feelings and organize them into political kind of formations, the feelings don't matter. They just dissipate, and they just exist in their basements and in their kind of Mountain Dew empty can strewn rooms or whatever. I don't know. Can't remember the thing.
You mentioned resentment, right? So there's resentment, and there's a sense of there's failure itself, which is a kind of emotion. It's a kind of feeling. Feelings of resentment. How do you think those become feelings of hatred, right? Because often people talk about the far right's kind of dominant affect is hatred. People talk about hate groups. There's a British charity called Hope Not Hate, and so on. Like, how do you think resentment turns into hate without giving a kind of a Yoda speech where he's like, fearless is suffering, suffering is I don't remember exactly what he says. Jordan Peterson has a very similar riff, so maybe there's some sort of connection there. But yeah, how does these feelings of resentment lead to a feeling of hatred, do you think?
Well, it's you have to consider where these kind of alienated and kind of very sad people end up online, because of social optimization. A lot of our lives are spent on, a lot of young people's lives are spent on forums and whatever, places like 4chan and 8chan. What are the dominant cultures of those forums? How does it breed a kind of callous attitude to other people? And how do those feelings of callousness and those attitudes solidify and articulate themselves in things like the alt-right, which is, again, what we say in the book. It's like when we talk about places like 4chan and 8chan, which are like internet forums, which are kind of known for, they're very chaotic places. There's a lot of different stuff going on in them. There's also a lot of like kind of racism and fascism and this kind of stuff happening on there. We kind of characterize these places in the book as a form of collective self-harm, like self-isolating together. There's a kind of reveling in the failureness. And it's from these places in which the alt-right was kind of birthed in many ways, although it is a very chaotic movement. We also have to look at things like kind of pre-alt-right kind of political reactionary mobilizations, particularly Gamergate, but there's also the kind of economic crisis of 2008, these kind of immiseration of people on a kind of mass scale, is a start for this stuff as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's always a history, right? There's always a way in which you can tell the story of the emergence of these kind of things.
We kind of joke that it all goes back to 9/11, and in some cases that's really true.
That is true. Yes. Pretty much all historical questions can be answered by the reply 9/11. We talk about two particular kinds of feeling in the book, and to get particular kinds of hatred as well, which are misogyny and racial hatred, racism. I'm wondering how you think that we did in terms of like describing that. Like how well, let's first of all give what our account is, right? Our account is that people on the far right have kind of like these inchoate sexual desires, like lots of people do, and there is a kind of a gendered distinction that emerges within contemporary society, right? In that people who are kind of failures under capital often turn towards essentially forms of quite shallow consumption addictions, basically, or compulsions to consume. These are things like pornography addictions and gaming addictions and gambling addictions and these kind of things, right? These are things you could do online, and therefore they're kind of next to, like in the sense that everything online is kind of next to everything else online. They are things that are exactly adjacent to forms of these kind of cultural spaces like 4chan, 8chan, and so on. And because there is such a kind of a dense affect of failure, experience of failure that goes into fulfilling these compulsions, fulfilling these forms of addiction, one starts to resent the object of the addiction, right? So let's take pornography, for example, right? Like whatever else people might think about pornography, and of course it's a kind of contentious subject, I guess, on the left still, it's undeniable that pornography shows people who are stylized into their like biological form. The women are women, the men are men, and also into their racial form, right? Like there are kind of particular genres of like kind of interracial porn, right? This is like a major market, and you can see that these have like incredible affective resonances with members of the far right, because this is what they use to humiliate each other, right? So on, for example, 4chan and 8chan, people will send pictures of scenes from porn films that contain like some sort of a black guy and like a white woman, and they're like, aha, this is you. You are cucked, right? You have failed to protect women, white women, from what they understand as the kind of the ravages of black men and so on. And so in some ways, in this kind of act of humiliation, we get all the different kinds of parts that we've been discussing so far of this kind of affective system. On the one hand, you get a feeling of resentment that turns into a kind of a weaponization. Well, I know that you are resentful of your own addiction to this stuff, therefore I'm going to weaponize it against you. I know that you have these kind of nascent racial hatreds, nascent racist feelings, therefore it has that component. I know that you hate women because you think that they have kind of dominated you through the form of pornography and the compulsion to consume it, and so on. And so all the kind of different aspects are contained within this single kind of this gesture of humiliating someone by replying to something they've said with this kind of picture, this kind of image, and so on. So there's a sense in which like there's a kind of a complete system here of feeling, which contains all the different parts of the far right. And so that's what we're trying to get at in the book. Obviously, there's much more to it, which we talk about extensively in the book. But we should move on, I think, to how this group of people who assemble broadly on 4chan, 8chan, and so on, how they turn into active political participants. And we have this figure in the book, the swarm. So maybe you could tell us a bit about that, Alex.
Yeah, so this is probably our central chapter to the book is kind of in the middle as well. The swarm and the influencer. And I think it's important to say them, together, swarm and influencer. When you think about the far right online, you think about, for example, the alt-right. It's not like a membership of a political party, and it's not a crowd. Like, it's people are kind of popping in and out of the swarm's activities at any one time. People are logging in and logging off, or staying online for hours overnight and for days on end or whatever. And they're also like an incredible diversity of different interests and kind of tendencies within that swarm. And the swarm can therefore be directed to do things. And it kind of does it as individuals subsumed into a kind of one particular mass. So if you think about the example of Gamergate and the kind of online harassment that happened to certain often women journalists and games makers, in that the harassment was all consuming and as one thing. It happened for a long period of time, and it was manifested a series of very abusive and horrendous messaging and videos and etc. etc. But the what made up that mass was a bunch of individuals logging off, posting maybe one thing or two things at a time, and then not posting at all, because the sheer mass of them all in one time gave them a kind of power. And oftentimes when this kind of phenomenon of the swarm it's not exclusive to the far right. It's a kind of, you see it quite a lot on different social media sites. People kind of forget their culpability when they're engaging in this kind of harassment, because they think, well, I only posted one message, so therefore, what is one message in what is one message in the grand scheme of things? And in actuality, that one message contributed to a whole swarm, a whole wave. So if you think about something like the alt-right, which was until it kind of manifested physically, in particularly most famously in Charlottesville, but in other places too, was an online kind of swarm focused around on the loci of Donald Trump and his election, and Trump as a god emperor. And what was that? What was the alt-right made up of? I mean, it was made up of, going back to our feelings, it was made up of incels. It was made up of trad Catholics. It was made up of actual identitarian fascists. It was made up of extremely far right wing young Republicans. All these different kinds of people, including for example generationally I suppose boomer posters. People who were posting on Facebook, and older people posting on Facebook and all this kind of stuff. And so it's this cacophony. It's this kind of roiling mass in which the alt-right kind of became. And without direction, it would kind of just exist there, and it would be it wouldn't really be directed against any particular person or towards any particular objective. And so to direct the swarm, we have these figures called far-right influencers, who are kind of part of the swarm, but also set apart from it. They kind of act as generals, but also as soothsayers, as kind of content creators, reading the room. And these are the people who, kind of articulate the swarm desires and direct it towards different things. And I suppose the primary example of an influencer, leaving aside Trump as the ultimate influencer, is a guy like Richard Spencer, who kind of founded the term alt-right, and it was a kind of intellectual, kind of quite dry, paleo-conservative kind of revival thing, and latched on to this kind of online thing, branded the alt-right, kind of took on Pepe the Frog as his kind of mascot, and set himself as the ultimate influencer, and interestingly directed Swarm, the alt-right, past Trump in a way. Richard Spencer is a declared fascist, and he Trump for him was not, his goal was a white ethno state, which was not ultimately Trump's goal. At least not explicitly.
Yeah, I don't think that was his goal.
No.
Yeah, that's. I mean, there was something I wanted to come back to there that you said, which was that in some ways, like their main capacity of the influencer is to read the room, right? Which is a style of leadership that you would not get in classical fascist parties, right? It's a style of control or ability to manipulate people that you would not expect from classical fascist leaders, although they were definitely kind of charismatic and able to give people what they kind of wanted to hear, but they were also able to command and demand that people wanted to hear what they were going to tell them anyway, right? So there's a kind of a sense in which like classical fascist leaders were able to impose their will upon their membership, right? So instead of having an audience and instead of having parts of the swarm that they then speak to, classical fascist leaders had organizations that had memberships that were kind of bound to their will in some sense. That's no longer really the case. There are membership organizations on the far right. We talk about some of them in the book in a section called New Organizational Forms, where we're thinking about how the swarm reconstitutes itself as the different parts of feelings and influencers and memes and metapolitics and so on. How does it cohere into new organizational forms? We talk about that a bit, but in some ways, like the capacity of the far right influencer today is really to read the room and to simply give the swarm, or to, as you said, like articulate what the swarm wants rather than tell it what it wants. And this kind of leads over time, I think, to a kind of very simple, in some ways, repetition. In that what the influencer is able to do for the swarm is never actually to give it something new, or to never actually articulate something in a new way, but ultimately just to kind of repeat and repeat and repeat in increasingly intense and emotionally gripping ways, all of the same points that the swarm already knows how to feel. And so what this means is that there is competition between influencers, right? If you want to think about this in kind of a absurd kind of Marxist terms, I guess here, like it's a kind of there's competition between the influencers for like the rate of return you can get on watching that content, right? You can watch the content for a certain amount of time and you can feel a certain intensity of emotion. And therefore people over time who are in the swarm, that is people who are in the audience, tend to latch on to more and more and more and more extreme influencers, because all the influencers are basically saying the same thing. They all have essentially the same set of ideas. The question is, how can they make you feel while they are saying the same thing, right? You go to an influencer, you watch their content for a certain kind of intensity of emotion. And so we get this situation in which like the influencers are kind of trapped by their swarm, by their audience. They can't tell them anything new. All they can do is just intensify and intensify and intensify. But in the context where they are dependent upon internet platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on, in the context where they are dependent on those, they can't go beyond a certain limit without being banned, basically. So if they stray too far, those platforms, less so Twitter, but the other two platforms will come down on them much more kind of forcefully. And so the influencers are kind of stuck in some sense between a pressure from their audience, which is to become more and more radical, and a pressure from the platforms they rely on to reach that audience, which is to never stray beyond the kind of terms and conditions. Although there is a kind of a leeway there at the same time. So these are some of the kind of dynamics that exist between the swarm and the influencer as two different kind of parts of the far right.
Yeah, and if you think about going past the scope of the book a little bit, think about a guy called Nick Fuentes who, after the January 6th riot on the Capitol, was pretty thoroughly deplatformed, and he claims put on a no-fly list and stuff. And Fuentes is one of the kind of one of the up and coming far right influencers who has this Groyper movement, which is a kind of entryist project into the Republican Party, try and turn it more and more right wing. And Fuentes is an avowed anti-Semite and misogynist and all this kind of different stuff. Like, I mean, he's very explicit about the anti-Semitism. It's not a kind of code word.
This is not code. Yeah.
And we kind of see the Fuentes, after he has been deplatformed, set up his own streaming site, has kind of developed his own kind of video hosting technology, which has allowed him to carry on. And he's a very major figure within the US far right, and is having certain success within the his America First movement is having certain success within the Republican Party, largely because it is tied to a kind of Trumpian project. Well, it explicitly tied itself to a Trumpian project. And yet he is still limited by not having these millions of people at his disposal to share, not having this kind of capacity to expand very quickly or get his kind of tweets and get his videos into a lot of different places very, very quickly. He's stuck to the core audience. And whether that core audience is able to grow is a question of, it's a question of whether the Fuentes can move his audience from an audience into a movement, which is a very difficult thing to do. And so just quickly, if you think about the alt-right and how it started to fall apart after Charlottesville due to a lot of different factors, largely partly because Trump started more distance himself from it, partly because the tensions, the kind of momentum behind it after the election, Trump has started to recede, and these constituent elements started to fall apart. There was no forward momentum no more. There's difficulty in getting offline, and we had this question. I had this question talk recently about whether there is any tactics here for the left. Should we have left-wing swarms, online swarms, and things like this? And the danger for the far right, in particular, I'm not going to really address the left right now. The danger for the far right is that coming offline carries a certain set of risks, very real physical risk. Risk of getting punched in the face by an anti-fascist, risk of being arrested, risk of being doxxed and exposed and ridiculed online in a way that you can't be if you're hiding behind your Pepe avatar. What we saw with Charlottesville was the alt-right as it was, in all its cacophony, and the kind of if you see the kind of downfall of figures associated with Charlottesville, particularly Richard Spencer, we talked about earlier, who attempted a kind of to rebuild with a kind of free speech tour of universities, campuses in America, college campuses, and was pretty roundly opposed, and eventually said that the reason why he couldn't carry on was because of anti-Semitism. That kind of stuff can't happen online in the same way. You can appeal to Facebook and Twitter to ban somebody, but you can't, in that way physically oppose the far right.
Yeah, because although you can't be on these kind of mainstream platforms, there is always another platform, seemingly, right? There's always going to be something else, some like further step that you can take to find a way of communicating with people around you. The kind of immediate one after YouTube is BitShoot, which is kind of video hosting website, which recently clamped down on some of its far right kind of parts. Then after that, there's a whole sequence of other very even like progressively smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So BitShoot probably has 1%, if that, of YouTube's traffic, and then like everything after that has like 1% of BitShoot's traffic and so on. So you get this kind of power law distribution where like the very, very top, like 95% of all video traffic is on YouTube, and then like incrementally smaller and smaller and smaller after that. So there are kind of trade-offs. What that does produce, though, what that does allow for, is for you to be talking very directly to people who will kind of support you in often much more direct and obvious and intense ways than people would on the kind of the wider internet, right? You can have an audience of kind of 100,000 people, and each of them maybe like on average gives you like kind of 1 cent, or you can have an audience of kind of 100 people and they're all dedicated their lives to this stuff. I was kind of wondering, like, this is a question I don't have an answer to, so maybe you or someone in the audience will know. How do you think the kind of the seeming kind of waning of Facebook as a particular platform will change the dynamics of the far right in particular? So by waning of Facebook, I mean that, as everyone probably knows, about a month ago, maybe less than that, maybe like a week or two ago, Facebook had, for the first time ever, a decrease in the total number of users, active users. And this led to a kind of a plummeting of its share price. It lost about 23% of its entire share price, pretty much in one day. And so there's a kind of sense that Facebook, although it was completely hegemonic and dominant, not in video, but in pretty much everything else, in the 2016 election, around the main period of the alt-right, although it's completely dominant then, in some ways it's dissolving and slipping and slipping and slipping and slipping and slipping. Facebook is quite particular as a platform for the far right. If you look at the posts that perform the best on Facebook, like if you look at the top 10 posts every week, which is a list that you can go and see, like on an average week, like 6 of those are Ben Shapiro. It's like one guy, like they're all Ben Shapiro, and Ben Shapiro is on the far right, I guess, but he's not a neo-Nazi. Obviously, he's not a fascist, I don't think. And so I was kind of wondering, what do you think the waning of Facebook as a particularly hegemonic platform, does that mean that we will get towards a situation where the internet is once again more scattered, more open, and therefore these groups, my light is going off, these groups that have retreated to smaller and smaller platforms, might those smaller platforms in general become more relevant over time or not? What do you think are going to be the dynamics of hegemony for Facebook, other platforms in the next few years?
I mean, Facebook is always quite a difficult one just because it's much more segmented to your immediate networks in a way that Twitter is not, and in a way that TikTok and these kind of things are much more open, and you can stream, you can the kind of part of the thrill of and part of the reason why sometimes deplatforming might be a good answer is that part of the thrill of being on Twitter is the ability to very easily trigger the libs. Like you've got to be with people who will be shocked by your behavior in order to get the thrill out of it or to get some political meaning out of it. And so like if you go to Gab or Parler, there's a lot of people who use Gab and Parler, a lot of far right people, but the problem it runs up against is there's no lefties on there, and there's no liberals on there, and there's no Democrats on there, and so you can't, it's no fun. You're still going around saying the same racist things to each other, and everyone's agreeing, and then there's no one there to be like quote retweet and say this is shockingly racist and better than Nazi. And for these people, for a lot of members of the swarm, it's not necessarily like a political forward-moving project in that way. It's a form of entertainment, political entertainment. You log on to trigger the libs, and I log on every day, and I got 4 accounts, and they all reply to each other, whatever. And in that way, Facebook was useful to kind of far-right influencers who are not the swarm, like the Shapiros or Steven Crowder, what's he called? Steven Crowder, those kind of people, because they've got a very dedicated audience, and a very captive audience and a very loyal audience. Facebook has shrunk a little bit with new members, but the people who are still on the Facebook a lot and still using it loads and all that kind of stuff. But it's an interesting platform to think about.
Like Facebook is kind of like a space for the already established institutional far right to like speak, right, rather than a place for people to become influencers, right? Like I don't know. Can you think of anyone who became an influencer particularly on Facebook? Like lots of influencers on the far right became influencers through doing podcasts, through doing YouTube shows. Huge number of them. Lots of them became far right influencers through Twitter. I can't think of anyone that became particularly prominent through acting on Facebook. Maybe it's simply a generational thing. So, for example, like lots of the Ottawa protests at the moment, which are kind of indeterminate in some sense, but they are seemingly organized quite a lot through Facebook. And so I'm kind of wondering if it's a kind of just generational shift. And so the people we talk about in post-internet far right who mostly skew younger, not entirely, but mostly who they skew younger, might not be so prominent in that.
Should we move on?
Let's move on. Yeah, let's talk about ecofascism. Yeah. Or do you want to talk about PA?
We could quickly talk about Patriotic Alternative.
So tell us. So like I'm going to kind of phrase this as a question relating to what we were just talking about. Like we mentioned a bit earlier the idea of the new organizational form that is out of the swarm, the influencer, the nebulous forms of feelings, the kinds of metapolitics. So metapolitics is basically the idea that politics is downstream of culture. So if you want to change culture, you really have to change culture. Sorry, if you want to change politics, you really have to change culture, right? So the idea is that you do things in the cultural sphere, and that changes politics. That's what metapolitics is as a strategy. And so out of all these different kind of parts, out of, for example, stunts and so on, you get these new organizational forms. When you're writing the book, the most prominent of those was a group called Generation Identity, who are now very much kind of nowhere near as important as they were when we were writing the book. But one of the ones that has stuck around, and in fact has become kind of more, I think, kind of worrying, is a British group called Patriotic Alternative? Do you want to tell us, like, give us a bit of an intro to them and tell us, like, how do they fit into, and also how do they kind of break beyond this mold of the post-internet far right?
Yeah, so the PA is led by a guy called Mark Collette, who was, a youth leader of the BNP and went on to be another kind of leader of the BNP and got kicked out in high dudgeon and kind of reinvented his career as a far right influencer. He had a weekly video show. I suppose he was on YouTube then, called This Week in the Alt-Right, clearly glomming on to, the alt-right as it was growing, even though he's in the UK. And he kind of converted that into another show called Patriotic Weekly Review. And off the bat of that, founded a political organization called Patriotic Alternative, which is now, one of the fastest growing, explicitly fascist organizations. They kind of quite clearly state that they are ethno-nationalists, not civil nationalists. They are racist. They are for white people, and they're quite happy to say this. And if you look a little bit further into their content, they're quite happy to deny the Holocaust quite explicitly and this kind of stuff. You go on Telegram groups and you look at the kind of stuff their membership or their audience is posting. It's like veneration of Hitler, anti-Semitism, a lot of like quite explicit stuff that's not hard to find. What PA is an attempt to move past a model, almost classic influencer model pioneered by Tommy Robinson, and also get past the politics. So what Tommy Robinson was really capable of doing was turning out his massive online audience, which he built through Facebook and through his Twitter and his YouTube. It's particularly his Facebook account, which we've got millions of tens of thousands of shares and millions of views on posts. To turn that audience into a street movement, in that he could turn the audience onto the street. And that was effective to a great degree. The Free Tommy marches saw, some of the biggest far-right marches, ever, 15,000 people, since, the 1930s. But there was no sense of a movement in the Free Tommy. It was an audience that didn't have effective bonds with each other. They weren't kind of connected to each other. They didn't relate to each other. They related on an individual basis to Tommy Robinson. And so when his style started to wane, and more importantly, when he started getting deplatformed from Facebook and Twitter, they started to kind of lose interest. They started to turn, because he was no longer in their immediate vision, they stopped thinking about him. And so, later Free Tommy demonstrations were much smaller. He's trying to kind of relaunch himself. He was recently in Telford. He's kind of agitating around a grooming gang scandal that happened in Telford. And he got about 1,000 people, which is quite a lot, but it's nothing like the heyday he had, simply because he's turning people out through Telegram and through Getter or whatever the app is using. I can't remember what it's called. So PA is an attempt to move on from that model, and it's doing that through converting Colette's live stream audiences into kind of these private meetup events in a kind of explicit attempt to do kind of white community building. How successful that will be remains to be seen. I think there'll be a ceiling. I don't think we've reached the ceiling as of yet. I think if it tries to expand beyond these kind of private meetups into more public activism, it will face more opposition, and maybe perhaps that audience, which has kind of got used to these kind of quite relatively safe private kind of walks and, whatever they do, museum visits and stuff, whether they kind of stick around after opposition from anti-fascists it remains to be seen. But it's this kind of conversion of an audience into a political organization where we have to kind of, as anti-fascists, which where we can make our most impactful interventions.
So we're going to turn to audience questions in a second. So if you have any questions, please write them in the chat, or put them in the Q&A. So I think either will do. I mean, I can see both of them. So any questions that you have about the book, any criticisms you have of the book, any things you'd like us to clarify, any things you think we got wrong, any things you think could be expanded, and so on. Would you like us to write a book called Post-Internet Far Left?
No.
I think it'd be very funny. Apparently not. Any questions like that? So before we do that,
should we talk about ecofascism maybe?
Well, I wanted to say one thing about, we'll talk about in a second. I want to say one thing about what you were talking about just there with the influencer to kind of movement dynamic. Yes, so Brandon has just written a question. Could you speak briefly on ecofascism? That's what we're going to do. We're going to do it next. So yeah, hopefully we will answer that question. But thanks. That's really good. So on this question of like the movement between an influencer system and a kind of movement system, people often talk about Nazi Germany and its and the individual relationship people had with Hitler. Right, Hitler becomes a kind of a figurehead or an avatar for the entire German nation, for the Nazi Party as a whole, and so on. And he does this in the same way, in some ways, like in the contemporary situation, where they have new technologies, basically. Like they have this this radio that you're not allowed to turn off that is broadcasting Hitler's speeches into your house directly. That's happened, of course, after it's turned into a dictatorship. But nevertheless, there's a kind of a set of new technologies that allows the fascist movement to broadcast itself, to dominate life. But it's not just that aspect, right? It's not just that there is a kind of personal relationship that Hitler is able to construct, you imagining, right? You're not just imagining a relationship with Hitler. You're also able to progress in your life to like have quite a serious level of career advancement through the Nazi Party and then into the public sector, right? And into the state, basically. And the Nazis are very, very good at taking apart or like kind of destroying the state in such a way as it allows their people to kind of be promoted into place. And therefore, on the one hand, although there is this kind of sense of being overawed, which is similar. I mean, there's not much similar between these two movements. Similar to the Tony Robertson thing, where you're kind of overawed by him, although of course his performances are very, very different from Hitler's and his politics too. In the patriotic alternative model, there is the sense that it might be possible to construct an entire life existing through this organization. And that's what makes it, people have kind of fanatical attachments to it. And it's also what makes anti-fascist action against it so kind of useful and means it stands such a high chance of success. Because if you can prove to people that they are not going to be able to make a life through existing in this organization wholesale, then the dream that they have of kind of being in this party as a kind of a way of saving themselves starts to dissipate. And that's really important because it means that people are no longer committed to this kind of institutional route to power and so on. But yes, let's talk about ecofascism. Alex, what is ecofascism?
Yeah, we've been thinking about this quite a lot, haven't we?
Yeah, we have.
Have that whole book. We do actually have a little bit about ecofascism in the book.
We do, yeah.
A small teaser chapter, as it were.
In this one,
yeah. But yeah, if you want the full explication, go and get the other one.
This one.
Yeah, it's got a burning something on the cover, burning tree.
Forest,
yeah. Trees are forests, aren't they? Anyway,
famously,
people often kind of conceptualize of fascism as responses or accounting for crises. And we can think of the kind of interwar fascism as a kind of response to not only the financial crisis, the depression, but also a little bit further back, the crisis of masculinity and general wide-scale trauma of the aftermath of the First World War and the Spanish it's not the Spanish flu anymore. Well, the flu that happened after the First World War, and we can see this quite a lot even recently. And so we see the uptake in far right activity after the Great Recession, another financial crisis, but also after there's a kind of constructed crisis in the migrant crisis, which was kind of constructed by the far right, fed on by the far right, and ultimately used by the far right to propel themselves into kind of governments, and governmental far rights became much more of a thing. So that in Italy and Hungary, for example, on the back of the so-called migrant crisis. These crises don't have to be real in a sense; they can be constructed. And so what we got to thinking was what would the far right response, what would be the fascist response to the biggest crisis of our time and the one that's going to define the next century of our life, well, the rest of our lives, and define the next century, which is the climate crisis. The breakdown of global climate systems, and what is the kind of authoritarian response to that? People kind of think of responses to climate change is like an inherently progressive lefty issue, investing in renewables, the climate justice, is kind of the activism around COP26, for example, all kind of, seen as responses to the climate crisis. But there are other responses to the climate crisis, and ones that, the position of the far right, in governments and, with strong movements, is more likely to be a response. These kind of racist responses to the climate crisis, fascist responses to the climate crisis, authoritarian environmentalism, which we talk about in the other book. And so we wanted to think through ways of doing, like opposing that kind of far right environmentalism, eco-fascism. But to oppose that, we need to understand its forms and then what its arguments are. And I suppose if you want to talk about this quickly, oftentimes we've seen like far right environmentalists and eco-fascists articulate various forms of kind of authoritarian nature as kind of cornerstones to their kind of thinking on ecology and climate. And I wondered if you wanted to talk about that briefly.
Yeah, sure. I was going to say that in some sense, like ecofascism is. I was rereading this one today in preparation for this, and there's a thing we say on page 10, which is actually the second page of the book, but it's called page 10. And Alex told me not to do any readings, but I'm going to read this one sentence. The far right is in a state of productive diversification. It is yet to cohere around a new stable formulation. However, it almost certainly will, and we must be ready for it. So there's a sense in which, like, at the moment, with the arrival of the internet produces such kind of complicated and in some ways incoherent kinds of political expression that the far right like does lots of different things. So that's the reason why there are so many chapters in the book, right? Because the far right is doing a whole bunch of different kinds of things. And then we're thinking about, okay, well, how might these different things interact with, as Alex says, like a bunch of different crises that emerge from climate change? Like how might they kind of cohere? How a new, more or less stable, I mean, always unstable on the far right because it sits on a kind of contradiction in capitalism, but nevertheless, comparatively more stable version of the of far right politics. How might that cohere in the context of the climate crisis, right? And so the ecofascism is our answer to the question, like, what might be the future of the far right? And therefore, it is to some extent indeterminate. It is to some extent a kind of an open idea at the moment. We use in our book on ecofascism, we use the term far right ecologism to describe what we're talking about, because as Alex said, like it contains all these things like environmental authoritarianism and different kind of aspects of what people have often lumped together as ecofascism, but which can be, I think, fairly usefully taken apart. Again, the reason for taking things apart in this book and in the other book is not because we are kind of academics, kind of sitting back, kind of surveying the field, making fine distinctions, kind of obsessed with our own kind of like cleverness and about making distinctions, but because taking these groups apart or making the groups clearly different from each other is the best way to make the contradictions between them visible. And once you know what the contradictions between them are, you can make them fall apart. You can make the different groups on the far right transparently incoherent, right? And that is a very effective anti-fascist tactic. Getting the far right to fight itself is by far the best anti-fascist tactic. It's difficult to do because it requires a certain clarity about how the far right is operating, but that's the point of the book, to offer something like a clarity about that. The other part of your question, Brandon, is how do we start research about it? This is a complicated question, right? It seems very simple. It's a complicated question. I think for the
research about ecofascism.
Yeah, good. You've probably got an answer.
We've done that already. We wrote a book. Just read our book.
So I think Brandon is interested in like thinking further than perhaps gets offered in the book. But I would obviously recommend as a minimum, as a beginning, reading our book on that. So there are several different ways. We wrote a book that in Ecofascism 1 that starts from the far right and looks at how it might engage the climate crisis. But there are lots of other groups that start by engaging the climate crisis, and then you can think about how they might turn into the far right, or how they might adopt far right ideas, right? So this is a kind of an image of ecofascism that progresses from the other side, that moves from environmentalism to racialized forms of environmentalism, or far right ecologism, as we call it. That seems to be an equally plausible train by which something like ecofascism might emerge. So I guess the question I would have to this question is like, are you more concerned about the far right adopting environmentalism, or are you concerned about environmentalism movements adopting the ideas of the far right? Because those will have totally different research strategies behind them. We've done the first one, we haven't really done the second one. And so if you're more invested in environmentalism as a discourse, which you should be, I mean, it should be absolutely clear if it's not already really obvious, being an environmentalist does not make you on the far right. Like, it's not a fascist care about nature. Lots of people care about nature. So yeah, depending on which one of those two streams you're particularly concerned by, I would, I'd have a different answer. So that's ecofascism. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A,
right, nice.
which we will now answer. Is that okay, Brandon? Thank you very much. Yeah, great, cool. Any other questions, please do write them in. We'll come to them kind of in due course. Okay, first question from an anonymous attendee. Don't know if you mentioned this in the book, but did you talk about why the far left is so much better at advertising than the left? They are better, more effective at getting their slogans out. It feels like they're better at recruiting. Yes, that's true. And it's a very good question. Any thoughts on this, Alex?
Why is the far right better at advertising
than the far left? Or than the left, right, in the question?
I think the far right is better at being more visible and more present online. I'm not entirely sure it's better at recruiting, or maybe it just feels that way. Although, you know, I think there's something to the idea that although, you know, people in these like online far right spaces do bully each other quite a lot, and it's kind of a form of collective self-harm, there is also a kind of building of a kind of oppositional culture, online culture, to a kind of blandness of contemporary life, which is quite compelling, and it brings people into that kind of movement. But we've got to think about how that kind of onlineness is engaged with, how that presence is engaged with, because it's only there is a proportion, not a big proportion, of this online swarm or online far right, which are very dedicated to it and posting every day and have multiple accounts and are like very invested in the furtherance of a kind of far right project. And there's a bunch of other people who are kind of just kind of flit in and out and kind of say reaction things to get a reaction. I mean, say fascist things to get a reaction, and to like be edgy, and not necessarily commit to a fascist project, an ongoing fascist project, either online or in, you know, the physical world. So there is a level of acceptance that I think that is difficult, often with the left, and I don't want to talk too much about left, but often there's a kind of understanding that you have to have read a specific set of texts and understand them and be able to articulate them clearly enough.
You don't.
You know, you don't have to.
Apart from our books.
Yeah, whatever. You don't even have to read the books if you don't want to. Sorry, I distracted myself by.
Yes,
what do you think? What do you think? I think it's personally quite a hard question to answer, because having been thinking about this stuff very intensely for a very long period of time, it's quite easy to be overwhelmed and think, oh shit, they're everywhere. And really, we're talking about a very small subset of online activity and a very small subset of political activity too. So yeah.
Yeah, I think the way we express this in the book is about partitioning of the internet, right? In the sense that everything is maybe there are two parts to it, right? One part is that far right culture, as you can tell from its name, right? So it's on the extreme end of the distribution. Far right political culture is edgy, right? It is uncomfortable. It is meant to stimulate a certain kind of response, a certain kind of sense of grittiness or discomfort in its audience. That's part of it. and it's supposed to be uncomfortable, as Alex was saying. Like there's a kind of adversarial or combative culture that emerges there, but it's also like in the ideas itself, right? The ideas are combative, the ideas are adversarial. There is a pure nation and there are the outsiders. There is the good race and there is the bad race. There is like the heroic men and the seductive and treacherous women, right? Like these are like adversarial ideas already. And so I think because so much of everyday internet participation works on a certain currency of edginess already, the far right slips into that very easily. And it's not just that there's a kind of there are kind of people enjoy being like racist online, right? Like there's a certain enjoyment of kind of pushing boundaries, of playing with the fact that online communication, for example, famously typing, much less like informationally rich than face-to-face speaking, right? And so playing with the ambiguity, playing with the kind of the difficulties of communicating online is already built into how the internet produces communication. And therefore edginess is like a very, very small step. And therefore inside edginess, knowing what the taboos of society are at large, and the taboos are very much, and this is something we should emphasize again and again, it is taboo in pretty much all kind of Western society to be racist. That is a taboo thing to say. Even people on the very far right often have to cloak their ideas. They have to say, no, we're not racists. Some of them don't, most of them do, right? And therefore you can tell that there is a kind of a penalty that is being paid for this. And so edginess emerges as a kind of a way of communicating that is native, I think, to the internet. On a larger scale, there is a sense in which there's the capacity to partition the internet, to make like this website and not this website, and so on, the far right website. And so insofar as people are able to do that by like making things more uncomfortable to be around, making websites kind of difficult to use and so on, which is what trolling is supposed to be about, they're able to carve out spaces for themselves on the internet that means that they seem more present than they are. But as Alex was saying, like when those people materialize out on the street, right? When those groups of people who seem to be massive and complicated and powerful materialize out on the street, we often find out there are very few of them, and they are not very good at organizing. George has a point in the chat. We are the 99% is a way better slogan than anything the right have yelled about for the last 20 years. The difference is that capital and state power tend towards the right way easier than the left, and they currently have a lot of power to decide.
That's actually a really key point. It's something I wanted to talk about, in that there's a much more ability for capital to accept the far right, and because they accept far right ideas and policies and whatever. And you can see this, for example, with the kind of Fortress Europe style, the kind of killing fields that are happening in the Mediterranean, that the European, the kind of border crisis. The border, the atrocities that are happening at the border and in Calais, there is an accommodation to kind of casual, like a kind of policy racism, and kind of borders and these kind of police institutional racism with the police, for example, which are in step with, they are not, but they are in step with far right, ideas and activism and things like that, in a similar way that the left is not. The liberatory politics the capital is not interested in tearing down borders necessarily in the same way.
No. At least not borders for people. Yes. Borders for capital. Yeah. So
there is a kind of general, I suppose, there's a feeling that the far right is more successful just because of this overall attitude of overall stance of capital that is more accommodating to the far right and can incorporate far right governments, for example, Hungary or wherever, into a kind of more global system of exchange.
Yeah, like one of the things we say in the eco-fascism book is that we give a definition of the far right, a fairly kind of broad far right, which is that the far right is the collection of ways of reproducing society that are necessary to, but forbidden under liberal capitalism. Right, and so these are the kind of the things that are just beyond the pale. That liberal capitalism nevertheless needs to reproduce itself. Right? It needs there to be a extremely strong, what do they call it? Like push factor against migration which is that thousands and thousands and thousands of people have died in the Mediterranean, and thousands and thousands of people have died on the southern US border. Right? That is an integral part of liberal capitalism. It's not like this kind of far right thing that's kind of coming in from the outside and it's integrated into it. But it is a site where the far right can see its politics materialized, see people die in the way that it wants people to die. Right. And so there is this kind of ambivalence all the time about like what is in liberalism and what is outside liberalism, what the far right consists of, what the far right doesn't consist of. We were talking to someone earlier for an episode that's coming out in a couple of weeks' time about Eric Zemmour. And she was saying that there's this problem because lots of people, so Eric Zemmour is kind of a rising star of the French far right. And France famously has this kind of two-part electoral system where the president as a two-stage election. There's like all the candidates, and then the top two candidates from that go through to a second round, and in the second round there's another vote for those two candidates alone. And what this does is pushes out extremists, right? Because basically people don't want there to be a fascist in power. That's that's the majority of French society, but they will vote for the fascist at the first election, at the first stage of the election. And so she was saying that. And this has been happening a few times. So that there's Le Pen and other people, both Jean-Marie Le Pen, who's the grandfather of the Front National, and also Marine Le Pen, who's the current leader of it. They have both been in this kind of final matchup, and both of them have lost really quite dramatically to the incumbent or to the more kind of centrist president. The idea being that, but the problem now rather is that because Macron, Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, has put through so many laws about the increase in police violence, the capacity of the police to kind of wield violence unopposed. He's been clamping down on protests in various forms and so on. His kind of reforms sparked the Gilets jaunes protests and so on. Right? Because Macron has been so kind of, in some ways, authoritarian, people are increasingly not seeing what the point of voting in favor of Macron against Le Pen would be. And so as the crisis of capitalism, which we've been living in for a very, very, very long time now, 13 years, I reckon, or thereabouts, maybe 14, 15 years, depending how you count it. That crisis, as it progresses, will require more and more and more and more and more kind of brutal forms of governance. And it's the liberals that increasingly provide that, right? And so although the far right is a separate thing, it's also kind of engaged in the reproduction of liberalism.
Have we got any more questions?
Yeah, we've got two more.
Okay, we should address them both before we finish. Right?
We will do, yeah. I mean, we've got 15 minutes. So Susanna says some people, the average Redditor, would choose Nazi Germany than any far left anti-capitalist society. Yeah. I don't know. Do you think that's true? So the claim is that the average Redditor would choose Nazi Germany over far left.
The average Redditor?
Yeah. I think Reddit
I don't think that's necessarily true, and I think it's less true now than it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I think there's a general turn against people like reactionary content. I think although it still has purchase, you see it in the various posts that are kind of popular. There's also an underlying critique and a kind of derision of the kind of fanboyism around people like Elon Musk and around, people like Peterson, and even around explicit fascists and figures, supporters of fascism and stuff. And I think if you look at the rise of subreddits like anti-work, which has over 1 million, kind of followers and things like that, the contestant, I think, has actually swung the other way. And that's partly because Reddit has ended up started banning some of these more extreme communities. Like if this point had been made, before the Donald subreddit that had been banned, then maybe it might be true.
Yeah.
But I think the problem that, a fascist kind of movement has in building on Reddit or literally any kind of platform that it doesn't control is that it can be kind of stymied very quickly. And so I don't think I would agree, although that's not to say that there isn't a lot of reactionary content on Reddit and reactionary people.
Susanna has written something else. So what about the average population of the US and the EU? I don't think so. I think that. So Joe Mulholt from Hope Not Hate, who we've had on the podcast, has this. I think social democrats will probably choose communism over Nazism, but I don't know how. Yeah, Joe Mulholt has this thing about a kind of history of instinctual anti-fascism that existed, and probably I think to some extent it still exists. He talks about it waning. He talks about there kind of being this dissolving of the anti-fascist consensus that emerged after the Second World War. But I do think that is still really quite present. Right? I think that the average social democrat, so for clarity, Susanna has written, also our anti-work, which is the subreddit Alex is referring to, which is against work, is full of liberals and social democrats. Would social democrats choose communism? She doubts it. I think they probably would. I don't think this is a choice that anyone's going to really have to face. So I don't think that we're going to have any kind of way of deciding this. But I do think that the instinctive anti-fascist and certainly anti-Nazi tendencies of the population at large are really quite robust.
I think it's also a lot of I think a lot of people would be subsumed into fascism if it was like an all-consuming political presence in a territory, and then people would like what happened with Nazi Germany, people would just go into it because it was the be-all and end-all, or that you could imagine a scenario where living conditions become so extreme where kind of any kind of answers to those conditions, no matter what it is, would become attractive to people. Yeah. But that's also to say that the other side of it is that, if there's a plausible, or kind of large communist or radical leftist project as well within a territory, that those same people will probably be subsumed into that too. And yes. It's not like people have there's a natural switch in people's brains that they're all naturally going to go towards fascism or naturally going to go towards communism just because of the way their brains are wired. It all depends on how things are set up fundamentally, materially. And I think that's a much more kind of, I subscribe to that because it does actually offer some kind of way forward for political organizing on a kind of broader scale. Anyway, should we move on to the next question?
Well, I just think it's to kind of point on that, the main thing I think that is the dominant political condition is indeterminacy, is a lack of clarity. That is the dominant political condition, and therefore these things will, as Alex was saying, they'll go in different ways according to the kind of the way in which the broad mass of people shift in accordance with the political projects that offer themselves most attractively to people. Which is in some ways why I think the decision doesn't make sense right now. Right, there is no choice between Nazi Germany or far left anti-capitalism. Right, there's a choice between slightly different variants of neoliberalism, and if you were to get into a situation where you could usefully actually propose the choice, you'd be in such a radically different place that I don't know if we could say anything particularly useful about it from here. Okay, 2 more questions. So George has written, how significant do you think conspirituality, or something like it, which combines individual self-care rituals with mythologies or cosmologies of natural hierarchies, etc., is in motivating fascist or far-right tendencies in the future? I'm going to read that again because that's a complicated question. So the question is, how significant really is conspirituality? Do you want to give a quick definition of conspirituality, Alex?
You do it.
Okay, so it's conspiracism plus spirituality. It's a portmanteau word. The idea is that there is a masculine conspiracy culture, which is dominated by men, and then there's a feminine spirituality culture, which is dominated by women. And that these two things, although they appear to have nothing to do with each other, in the last kind of 20 years, they have combined and recombined and become more kind of alloyed together.
I think it is going to be quite a significant factor, and it deserves further yes. Thinking. There's a guy called Matthew Remsky who we had on the podcast who has done a lot of thinking on this, and I think we collectively need to think about these kind of forms. If you look at something like the the convoy protests in Canada, there is this kind of mashup. I don't know how to say it.
It's a mashup, yeah.
Conspiracism, this kind of Manchian spirituality, this kind of anti-vax thing, all mashed up into one. And I think as kind of the stresses in society continue and grow and intensify, people will start to look towards self-help. And in fact, Peterson, part of the power of Jordan Peterson's kind of career, like his breakout was he offered very basic self-help and the spiritual system in which to articulate that, along with reactionary ideas. And that's why he became so popular. So yeah, I mean, we need to. I think it's really, that is an area that needs to be explored further. We should try and get to the questions.
That's okay. We've got some time. So
we've got 8 minutes.
That's okay. So yeah, just to say that there is a substantial section on conspirituality in The Rise of Ecofascism, which you can go and get from all good booksellers, including Housemates now. Yeah, there is. So it's one of the main things we talk about in relation to the kind of the collapse of a coherent scientific worldview. So one thing that climate change will do is make it more difficult to predict the future. I mean, in some ways, we've already seen kind of parts of this, is that not long-range trends and not short-range trends, but medium-range trends, as natural systems start to break down and become less predictable, it will become more difficult to work out what is going to happen in 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and so on. One of the things this might do is lead to a condition under which we have people in general have significantly less faith in scientific discourse than they previously did. And so I can well imagine that in that situation, both spirituality and conspiracy culture would reemerge as the natural world. And you've written here, George, about natural hierarchies. As the natural world starts to become, in some sense, like chaotic, it kind of is deranged in some sense, right? It kind of like falls apart. It seems to like not be kind of organized like it should be. There'll be enormous space for conspiritual ideas. It's also really important to say, just a final point of this, it's also really important to say that like everything else, or like lots of things we've talked about, conspirituality is not a quintessentially far-right movement. It's not a quintessentially far-right outlook on the world. And there are aspects of conspirituality that would be usefully understood from the left, or be usefully like grasped by the left, or given a kind of leftist spin. Those are all projects that I think people should be absolutely committed to engaging with. And this is why, people like Maureen Williamson, who I think is interesting, in America, who was very much of this kind of like not conspiracist, but spirituality trend. And someone she was kind of ridiculed by parts of the left. But I think absolutely there's a need to allow this kind of spiritual dimension into the left. Otherwise, it will be turned to the far right. Tim's got a question. Can I read this one out, Alex?
I love the Q&A up. You do it.
Okay. So Tim asks, are there anti-fascist strategies to deal with the young men you talk about in the fascist feelings chapter, to target young men and their sense of failure and win them over with leftist ideologies instead, or progressive forms of masculinity? Are there examples of that happening? Yes. Yes, yes, and yes. One way this works is just that political culture shifts. So the anti-work movement, for example, which is what we were talking about a moment ago, insofar as it is like one of the dominant political tendencies on Reddit at the moment, the anti-work tendency is a leftist tendency. And it speaks to essentially the same kind of sense of failure, sense of self-hatred that the far right speaks to, but does so from a liberatory standpoint that opposes the domination or the forms of domination that people are put into at work. So yes, I think it happens, and it can happen. I think that's a really good example of it. As to whether or not there are particular things that like anti-fascist groups can do, I think that's much more in the space of targeting particular individuals, particular people who have been quite intensely radicalized. And I know that Alex has some opinions about like what de-radicalization means versus like re-radicalization. So maybe we could talk about that for a second.
Yeah, I think it's quite difficult. It only depends what kind of alienated young man you're talking about. Is it just simply a online handle, an anonymous handle passed through a VPN, and you know just posting on 4chan? I think that person is outside of like broader cultural trends and change and more preventative measures. That person is by design unreachable. You know, people have gone on to 4chan and tried to post like stuff, and they get, you know, pretty roundly rejected. But I think there are ways of practicing your anti-fascism that does not alienate these people further. And so, for example, if you take the idea of doxing, for example, you want to be quite judicious with doxing, so exposing that the fact that they are a fascist to their job and whatever, because you know it could discourage them from becoming more organized, or it could just enmesh them further. You could like take away their family connections, take away any kind of normie outlet that they have, that any kind of possibility for normal quote unquote interaction, non-fascist interaction, and therefore they just kind of enmesh themselves further. And I think there's also a need to build kind of political organizations in which to draw people into. And so people get people out of their basements and bedrooms by providing a reason to self-organize to make their lives better. You know, I think of things like renters unions, for example, as a kind of very ultimately inadequate answer, but an answer in which, you know, you can improve your material conditions. So yeah, I mean, we're running out of time, so I've got 2 minutes. So.
We haven't got 2 minutes. We can be full here after 8:30.
No.
So
we need to finish.
Part of the radicalization process we talked about was this kind of entry into a very casual kind of interchange with people, like, you know, finding memes and circulating them, right? Like finding the most kind of edgy content and putting it in the group chat that you're in, right? These are the kinds of things that I don't think anti-fascists are capable of planning for. They're not the kind of things like that the anti-fascist organizations can like produce effectively. Anti-fascist organizations, in my experience, pretty bad at memes, pretty bad at getting content that's like useful, shareable, and so on. They've good visuals, good optics, great footage of demonstrations and so on. All that's fantastic, but pretty bad at memes. And it is really at that very, very, very small micro level that these things start to move. Fortunately, parts of the left beyond anti-fascism, what we call in the book maximum anti-fascism, which is namely the collection of different parts of the left that don't oppose fascism directly, but undermine the conditions for its arrival, right? Like the maximum anti-fascism of the broader left. Loads of parts of that are really good at memes. So in some sense, like if there's a de-radicalization process that's going to happen on a mass scale, then the left is already on it, but it doesn't have much to do with anti-fascism. And if there's going to be a de-radicalization or re-radicalization of particular people in particular organizations, then that strays much more closely to things like targeted interventions by like de-radicalization charities and so on, which I don't know really much about, unfortunately, sorry. Or at the most extreme end, it tends towards the intervention of the counter-terrorist police, right? That's who will be involved in that. So again, anti-fascists don't have much to do with that. So I think actually anti-fascism doesn't have a great deal to say at either of these two kind of scales, but it is very effective at making being in a far right organization absolutely no fun at all. And so yeah, those are the kind of the things that I think anti-fascist organizations are pretty good at. Making existence on the far right or existence in far right organizations like uncomfortable, which is effective, and that does work. So that's not a particularly hopeful answer, I think. But yeah, I think broadly the left is on it. I think it's okay. There is a shift in the culture anyway. And that is a feature of the wider left. We have, however, come to the end.
Yeah, if you want to buy the book, you haven't already, you should do that.
Yeah.
Buy the other one too. That's also good.
Yes.
Over there, behind the shoulder.
Voila, over here.
If you want to listen to our podcast, you should listen. If you want to support our work, you can subscribe to us on Patreon where we put up other stuff. I don't know. What else? Do you want to share anything?
No, I follow us on Twitter as well. We currently have just below 2,000 followers on Twitter, which means that we are, every time I look at the follower count, it's like a year. I mean, they're all years, obviously. Like every time, it's now like 1987 or something. Like I can think of events that happened in 1987. I want to get into the future, basically. So if we could get, above 2000, above 2022, that would be really good. Sana has written The Right Can't Meme, which is an excellent subreddit. I recommend that to everyone. Thank you for coming. We are 12 What's What. My name's Sam. This is Alex. Going by Post Internet Far Right. Thank you to Housemans for hosting us and for letting us kind of waffle on like this. Thank you to all of you for coming, and thank you for the really interesting questions. And goodbye.
Goodbye.